Welcome to Football Origins. Today we'll find out how one European country played a central role in founding an international football championship, a certain Football World Cup. Today the country that we're going to talk about is the first European country on this show so far. The football team is fondly called Les Bleus, one of my favorite teams, La France. First up we got key element numero 1, the initial years. The historical ties between France and the United Kingdom are long and complex, including conquest, wars and alliances at various points in history. The last major conflict between the two were the Napoleonic Wars. Although that was the last war, fears of further escalations arose near the 1850s. The two colonial powers were also tussling offshore over African colonies. Nevertheless, peace always prevailed. Having said that, either of them were happy to keep the other at arm's length. When Football Association was formed in 1863, it first made its way across the Channel to France through two different mediums. First through schools, predominantly in the region shown here, north of Paris. The first recorded instance was in 1867 in a suburban school west of Paris, where students got a taste of football thanks to few visiting students from England. By 1880, football will go on to become one of the preferred sports of students in schools and colleges. However, it wasn't necessary at the initiative of the PE teachers. It was mostly the professors of English who brought back footballs and FA rule books from their study trips to England. The second medium through which football piqued the interest of the French in the initial years was English people who demonstrated their football skills at French ports. For instance, whenever a merchant or passenger ship with English workers or travelers on board docked at French ports, in between loading and unloading goods, the workers would play a game of football. These occasions would serve as a demonstration for the local French residents. Having said that, the French were rarely invited to join the game, and the English would leave taking the football. So the local impact through this medium was negligible. This brings to a key element numero 2, the Brits living in Paris. 19th century France did not record migration per se in its population books. However, during the Industrial Revolution, the country did see waves of immigration from not only the United Kingdom but also from the rest of Europe. Nevertheless, it is safe to say, in the second half of the 19th century, there were a substantial number of Brits living in Paris, Normandy and Brittany, at least enough to start their own football clubs. In the 1870s, British residents had already founded rugby football clubs where they played a hybrid form of football and rugby called combination. In the 1890s, France saw a flurry of association football clubs founded by the British community in Paris and in Normandy. The most notable among them, White Rovers, Standard Athletic Club, Club Français, Racing Club de France and Le Havre. Players of all nationalities were eligible to play for these clubs with the condition that they speak English on the pitch. Unlike introduction of football in Latin America, the local French population was never not allowed to play football. White privilege. White Rovers is credited to have featured in a number of firsts for a French club, and the club was a considerable influence on helping football spread during this period. Racing Club de France was the first of the all French players football clubs. White Rovers is now defunct along with Club Français, which makes Standard Athletic the oldest club in France that still exists today. Now we head on to our key element numero 3, a sport not only meant for the bourgeois. In the second half of the 19th century, les bourgeois, or people belonging to well-to-do families living in French cities, were behind the movement of introduction of sports in France, such as rowing, athletics, etc. However, these French athletes were exclusively recruited from the best families in the country. The practice of sport is then perceived as a form of privilege. However, professionalization in sports will soon change that. USFSA was a French federation founded in 1887, which governed all of sports in France. Although the federation was created with the purpose of governing athletics, it soon opened up to other sports such as rugby, field hockey, fencing, etc., which were represented by their own specialized committees. The notable exception was football, which was apparently boycotted. When football became professionalized in England in 1885, we started to observe new facets of the sport, such as player transfers. Betting on football in United Kingdom, although illegal at the time, became rampant too. These were among the main reasons that the USFSA was not favorable in accepting football, claiming that betting was amongst the worst of British evils. However, by the end of 1892, 3 football clubs coexisted in Paris: the White Rovers, the Standard Athletic Club and Club Français, which began to meet regularly during the 1892-93 season. With football becoming popular with every day in the United Kingdom, there was an imminent threat that an independent league would be formed in France which won't be affiliated with USFSA. The federation eventually gives in and recognizes association football as a sport in France, greenlighting the first championship of France during spring of 1894. A total of 6 teams participated during this first edition, which was won by Standard Athletic, the club essentially becoming the first champions of France. Having said that, the first few editions of the championship only featured clubs from Paris. Around the same time, on the other side of the channel, the working class United Kingdom had taken a particular liking to football. It was not long before the working class in France was also won over by football. At the turn of the century, France had a population of around 40 million, which was among the highest in Europe. Several football clubs were founded outside Paris, which meant the championship soon expanded to other regions, especially in the north, such as Normandy. For few editions, the championship was contested among regional champions. Today, association football is more popular in the north of France, whereas rugby union more popular in the south, especially Basque country. Nevertheless, there were several association football clubs that were founded in the south during this period, especially Olympique de Marseille, a club which is part of football folklore now. Football in France grew from strength to strength as it captivated the working class and the elite alike. Right at the beginning of the First World War, there were approximately 200,000 licensed players and close to 2,000 clubs spread across the country. Not surprisingly, the war did put a pause on most club activities as their players got drafted. However, during both the world wars, football competitions were still maintained. France finally embraced professionalization of football in the year 1932, about 50 years after England. It was officially not a sport meant only for the elites. This coincided with the formation of a nationwide league called Division Nationale, which eventually became Ligue 1. Plus, there was already a Division 3 in the year 1936. This meant that the regional leagues were not as prominent as before. Parisian clubs were not the only clubs winning anymore. Moreover, French clubs started getting recognition across Europe. This brings to our key element numero 4, post-World War II immigration wave. The end of World War II brought in its wake the largest population movements in European history. Refugees from every country in Eastern Europe rushed to escape from the newly installed communist regimes. Moreover, in the decades after 1945, France would lose most of its colonies. There were uprisings in Madagascar and Cameroon, and brutal full-blown wars in French Indochina and later in Algeria, each of which claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and prompted an influx of millions of migrants into France from both the Maghreb and sub-Saharan Africa. To form an analogy, during the same period, the United Kingdom saw a similar influx of millions of migrants from its former colonies in the Indian subcontinent and in the Caribbean. In the coming years, French football was only to benefit from these waves when the first and predominantly the second generation of immigrants started not only participating at the highest level but also bossing the game in the French Ligue 1 and other European leagues. This brings to our key element numero 5, the great French ambition. As we all know, the French played a central role in reviving the modern Olympics. They were also central figures behind the foundation of Fédération Internationale de Football Association, the highest governing body of association football today, better known as FIFA. We will talk later under what circumstances FIFA was founded. But first, we'll talk about what FIFA has achieved since then and what it stands for today. FIFA's most significant contribution to football is undoubtedly the FIFA World Cup, a competition created in 1928 by Jules Rimet, a Frenchman who was then president of FIFA. Fascinated by the spectacle offered by the European team at the 1924 Olympics, Jules Rimet dreamt of a World Football Championship and started working towards it. The creation of this championship was ratified during the FIFA Congress of 1928 in Amsterdam, with the first edition of the tournament planned for 1930. In 1929, it was decided that Uruguay will host the first World Cup. However, they were not chosen just by chance. Uruguay had won the gold medal in football at both the 1924 and 1928 Olympics. Plus, it was the centenary of the Uruguayan independence. All playing for the trophy, originally titled the World Cup of Association Football, which was renamed in 1946 the Jules Rimet Trophy. Since 1932, FIFA is headquartered in Zurich, Switzerland. In 2016, its membership comprised of 211 national associations. These national associations must each also be members of one of the 6 regional confederations into which the world is divided: Africa, Asia, Europe, North and Central America and the Caribbean, Oceania and South America. It is a non-profit organization and it is also the governing body of futsal and beach soccer. This brings to our key element numero 6, the French national team journey. Although between 1900 and 1904, France under its Omnisport Federation USFSA fielded an amateur team as their national side for a total of 5 games, including the Olympic Games in Paris in 1900. These games, however, are not considered as official games of Les Bleus. The creation of the French football team is linked with the founding of FIFA in 1904. Their first official game was thus against Belgium in Brussels in May of that year, whereas in 1905 it was against Switzerland that France played their first home game. FIFA was founded in Paris on May 1904 at the initiative of Robert Guérin, the secretary of the USFSA Football Committee, with the objective of development of football across the world. Founding members were the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, Spain and France. In 1905, Germany, Italy, Austria and Hungary joined its ranks. One notable exception among them was England, which refused to become member but eventually joined in the following months. With England at the table, USFSA found itself in an arm wrestle of sorts against the Football Association. On one hand, USFSA, a federation notoriously known for their stand against professionalization of sports, and Football Association on the other, which had professionalized football in England in 1885, 20 years ago. However, these two associations didn't argument over professionalization. It was on the founding text of FIFA, which permitted one and only one football federation per country, a clause put in at the behest of USFSA in order to eliminate the formation of rebel leagues in France. Federations which won't be recognized by FIFA won't be allowed to play international matches. Therefore, USFSA demanded only one federation from United Kingdom instead of 4, that is, one from England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland each, given that the latter 3 had applied to join FIFA as well. Subsequently, this subject was to be voted upon by the members, and ironically, France found itself in the minority. Annoyed by this decision, USFSA or France decides to leave FIFA. However, France will not stay outside FIFA for long. Thanks to Comité Français and the Fédéral, USFSA's main competitor helped France rejoin. To no one's surprise, USFSA found itself marginalized once it left FIFA, an organization that it helped create. But it was still the Omnisport Federation in France that was responsible for sending teams to compete in Olympic Games. CFI and USFSA found itself at loggerheads during Olympic Games. During the 1912 Olympic Games at Stockholm, France forfeited only because the two federations couldn't agree upon the selection. During the First World War, France's international fixtures were obviously interrupted. A total of 17 French international football players lost their lives during the war. After the war, in April 1919, the Comité Français and the Fédéral was transformed to Fédération Française de Football, the famous triple F that we see on the French jersey today. It won't come as a surprise that Jules Rimet was its first president too. It was around the same time that the French national team adopted the color blue for its main jersey. And during the Olympic Games in 1920, the Gallic Rooster made its appearance on the French football jersey for the first time. Today, the color bleu or blue in French is associated with the French team in such a way in the French collective unconscious that to speak of Les Bleus is to speak of the national team. When it comes to winning world titles or European championships, the French football team, to be honest, was a late bloomer. They won their first Euro in 1984, whereas their first World Cup win only came in 98, when they hosted the event for the second time, which was no mean feat by any stretch of the imagination, given that they did not even qualify for the World Cups in 1990 and 94. But we have chosen none of these events as the international watershed moment. We decided to go with the World Cup campaign of 1958. The World Cup of 1958 in Sweden is best remembered as Brazil's first World Cup win, or the time Pelé introduced himself to the world. Some would remember it for Jules Fontaine's 13 goals, which still remains a record for the number of goals scored in a single edition. However, it's not just Jules Fontaine's exploits we have chosen this particular tournament. It's due to what was happening behind the scenes for the French national team, especially the build-up leading into this World Cup. France sent a young and inexperienced team to this World Cup. Moreover, this was the first instance that France had sent a team to a big tournament that included players of non-French origins, including the likes of Raymond Kopa and Just Fontaine himself. There were not many back in France who gave them a chance to succeed. That French team not only proved their doubters wrong, but also reached the semi-finals where they ran into Brazil, the eventual winners. They finished third in the tournament, which was France's best performance at the World Cup till then. France's performance in 1958 set the precedent for its future international campaigns, most importantly selecting their best 11 regardless of their origins. Sport is often called a mirror of society. Although France has had its fair share of civil unrest, troubled neighborhoods and rising inequality, time and again football has proved to be the bridge across the divide. And nothing captures the essence of modern day France than Les Bleus. In the past, there have been several vile attacks in the form of questionable statements made by far right-wing politicians regarding the French selection. but every time Les Bleus have shut out outside noise to bring laurels to France. From their World Cup wins and enthralling everyone with their French touch, to Zidane and Mbappe becoming household names, France is a true powerhouse of the football world. So that wraps up this segment. Hope you liked it. We are not going to talk much about the recent history of French football. It's already part of football folklore, and you guys definitely know more about it than we do. Do you reckon France could defend their world title and add a third star here this December in Qatar? Let us know in the comments below if we missed out on something about French football that we couldn't cram in this video. We are going to talk about one footballing powerhouse every episode, deep diving into their footballing history, learn about how football became so popular over there, and what India can do to replicate their success one day at the world stage.